listener production.
Happy Friday and welcome to The Briefing. I'm Sacha Barbour Gatt. Spring officially kicks off this weekend. For many, it means flowers, warmer weather, longer days and the start of daylight saving. But for magpies and Aussies who live near them, it's swooping season.
You get swooped and you don't know where the nest is. The best thing you can do is to stop and rather than run around wildly or try and attack the magpie or scream, is to stop, assess the situation, work out where the magpie has gone, try and keep an eye on it so you know if it's swooping you again, and they're less likely to swoop if you're looking at them.
In this episode of The Briefing, we're defending the magpies because, after all, they're only protecting their families, and we're also going to give you advice on how to befriend your local maggies. That is coming up in the second half of this episode. First, though, Helen Smith is here with the headlines. Today's Friday, August 30.
Bonjour again, Sacha. We're kicking things off once again in Paris, where we have crushed it in the water and won our first gold medal in the Paralympics.
Can Gallagher finish strong here? Tom Gallagher over the top of Rodriguez, gets it done. Tom Gallagher wins gold for Australia, their first at Paris 2024.
That audio from Nine and Thomas Gallagher there claiming the S10 men's 50-metre freestyle final. Rowan Crothers also took out bronze in the same final, while our flag bearer, Brendan Hall, won bronze in the men's, and Lakeisha Patterson took out silver in the women's S9 400-metre freestyles. Our wheelchair rugby team, the Steelers, were narrowly defeated by defending champs Great Britain 58-55.
Yeah, and in action right now as we record, Helen, are our two-time Paralympic gold medalists, the Rollers, who are taking on the Netherlands in the men's wheelchair basketball. And we've got Jameson Leeson in the women's B3 individual boccia, which is kind of like bocce, which is not an Olympic sport, but it's a Paralympic sport, which is cool. I did want to quickly touch on something that we had to look a little bit further into this morning, that references to S9 or S10 events. Now, what that is a classification system that is used in the Paralympics, and its purpose is to guarantee fair competition for all athletes at the Games. So what happens is athletes go through a classification process before they take part in the competition, and during that time they're assessed and allocated a sport class that is in accordance with the degree and the nature of their eligible impairments. So for example, an S11 in para swimming refers to competitors with a high level of vision impairment, while an SM1 to 10 refers to a physical impairment. So a really interesting little extra facet of the Paralympic Games and just how much these athletes have to go through to compete.
Changing pace now as we head to the West Bank, where Israeli forces have carried out raids for a second day in a row. The IDF says it has launched a counter-terror operation in the occupied Palestinian territory, killing at least 12 people in the cities of Jenin and Tulkarm. But the Palestinian Health Ministry says that number is higher at 16.
These developments are significant, and it shows that Israel is now fighting a war on three fronts, so in the West Bank, in Gaza and against Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. This has sparked calls from the UN for a de-escalation of the conflict, Chief Antonio Guterres calling on Israel to immediately halt its operation, saying it was, quote, fueling an already explosive situation. Something else that's happening in Gaza at the moment is an urgent vaccination program against polio, because the Strip is seeing its first outbreak in 25 years, which is just awful. So the WHO says it's secured temporary pauses in fighting to start this polio vaccination campaign. It's due to start this weekend with 640,000 Palestinian children to be immunised against the disease. Now, the World Health Organization says that the campaign will be completed in phases over 3 days. And what they're doing is they're breaking it down into zones. And apparently Israel has agreed to stop fighting and raids and anything in those areas where the vaccination program is taking place. It's atrocious that that is even a thing, to vaccinate children against such a horrible disease. Now, Israel has denied that there'll be a widespread truce in place. They've been kind of cagey about what they're doing, but seem to have agreed to what the WHO has suggested. Aid agencies have made it clear that this polio outbreak would almost certainly spread to Israel if it's not contained. So that would explain Israel being willing to halt fighting in certain areas during this vaccination campaign.
The Albanese government is under fire again over their decision not to collect sexuality and gender identity data in the next census. 6 Labor MPs, including Assistant Health Minister Jed Carney, are calling on the government to include the new questions, arguing that the government should stick to the principle in Labor's national platform. LGBTQIA plus advocates were in disbelief when the government confirmed the news on Monday, and Assistant Minister Carney said that the census not only informs policy and service delivery, but paints a picture of modern Australia in all its beauty and diversity, and that for too long the queer community has felt excluded from this picture. But not everyone agrees. Yesterday, Opposition Leader Peter Dutton declared the questions reflect a woke agenda, saying the current questions had stood us well as a country. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese is attending the Pacific Islands Forum at the moment, so he has not commented on the matter as of yet. One Liberal MP has broken ranks, Aaron Violi. He said on Wednesday that gender identity and sexuality were an important data point and part of our community conversation, and that this is quite hurtful and damaging to a lot of people in the community. Treasurer Jim Chalmers defended the government's decision yesterday, speaking to ABC's RN, and said that the reason that the questions weren't included was to try and avoid some of the nastiness that sometimes accompanies the lead up to the census, which I think it's doing the opposite. It's just put it into light, into question. It's making this a big debate when surely it's not that hard to include a few questions to make a community and reflect what Australia actually looks like on the ground. So yeah, well, it'll be interesting to see what the Albanese government comes to a decision on this. Now, we have done a really great deep dive on this on August the 26th, breaking down this decision. So if you want to learn more about it, you can check that out there.
And the Australian Bureau of Statistics has released some fresh data around the proportion of men and women in the population, which, funnily enough, is gathered by the census. So another census story. This is just straight data, though, so no controversy here. Look, it's found for every 99 men, there are 100 women in Australia. So we're beating them, Helen. We've also seen a breakdown of how old or young our capital cities are. We know we're an ageing population, but Darwin is the youngest with a median age of 34.6. It is worth noting, though, it's the only capital where there are more blokes than women. There are 104.7 men to 100 women in Darwin. Adelaide had the oldest median age at 39.2 years. Then it was Hobart at 38.9. Now, Sydney and Melbourne had younger populations than throughout the rest of New South Wales and Victoria. So the regional areas in those states are representing older than the capital cities. Sydney's median age is 36.8 years. In Melbourne, it was 36.6 years. So just a fun little look at kind of how we're broken down when it comes to sex and age, I suppose. A couple of really fun little facts I found. So WA's East Pilbara region had 274 men for every 100 women. Now, that is because it is a mining town and lots of miners in the area. Wacol in Brisbane, 278 men for every 100 women. And there were similar numbers in Chidlow in Perth. Now, that is thought to be explained by their local prisons because it's mainly prison towns, so it's full of blokes in jail. Fun.
Yeah, look, I'm definitely going to have a deeper look at these numbers and see where all the men are at because, look, they're obviously not in Sydney. So.
Well, maybe you need to go to prison towns.
I need to go to
Wacol.
Yeah, I need to go to one of these mining or prison towns. It's my only hope. But this is very useful data for some of us.
Yeah, great. All right. Hey, Helen, thank you so much. You're off on a holiday next week. Please enjoy. We'll miss you, but have the time of your life. Next up is our deep dive into swoopy boys, aka magpies. Springtime in Australia is pretty bloody wonderful. The cold weather is starting to ease and there's warmth in the air again. Flowers start to bloom and the days get longer. The promise of summer and Christmas holidays is right around the corner. But there is one other major event that happens in spring, and it can strike fear into the heart of nearly every Australian. I'm talking, of course, about magpie swooping season.
Hey! Oh! Ow!
From August to October, the iconic birds are nesting, and that means they're especially protective of their patch, sparking swooping attacks on innocent humans who just happen to walk by. It's caused people to be genuinely fearful of them, and fair enough, being swooped is not a lot of fun. But as a self-confessed magpie lady who came to befriend a flock of the birds during lockdown in Melbourne, I want to change your mind about them. Joining me today is the birdman himself, Sean Dooley. He's an avid birdwatcher and conservationist from Birdlife Australia, and he's here to tell us why we should learn to love our local maggies. Sean, welcome to the briefing. Look, first off, explain to us why magpies swoop.
Yeah, there's this misconception out there that because they swoop in spring that they're sort of, the males are testosterone filled and it's hormone driven and it makes them go crazy. But the reasons magpies swoop is because they're just being good parents. It's only the male magpies that swoop. Very rare for a female bird to swoop. And the males only will swoop when there's young in the nest, essentially. So they're just identifying targets that they think are a threat to those chicks and they want them out of their territory. So that's the prime reason. They're just being good parents.
Do we know how many Aussies are actually swooped every year and how many result in physical injury?
We don't know for sure. Probably the best proxy measure that we can go off are the magpie websites that alert people to where magpies are swooping, which in themselves can be a really good public service, but also kind of fuel that idea that there's gangs of magpies out there and fuel a bit of hysteria. But even just looking at the most used of those websites, usually there's about 3,000 to 4,000 swooping birds recorded every year, which when you consider that magpies are across almost the entire country, except for the very tropical areas like Darwin and Cape York Peninsula, and they're a very common bird, that 3,000 to 4,000 represents a very, very small percentage of the numbers of magpies out there. So it's definitely a case of not all magpies. But even on those websites where they do report swooping, you can tell that sometimes it's not a magpie that's doing the swooping. And at times I'm even not sure whether people have been swooped, they've had a magpie fly close to them. So those actual numbers are probably even lower. It's just that there's so many magpies that even a fraction of the percentage swooping will result in hundreds, probably thousands every year that will actually swoop.
Look, I'm a massive magpie fan, and one of the most impressive things that I've learnt about them is that they have incredible memories and they can remember faces and people because they end up living in the same suburbs sometimes for 20, 30 years. So I guess my question then is, if I make friends with my local magpies in January, will that avoid me being swooped come September? Definitely.
The magpie only swoops because it perceives you as a threat. And in the majority of cases, only 10% of male magpies will swoop anyway. And even those birds, they don't swoop indiscriminately usually. They'll pick out particular people or they will pick out a particular type of person. So often people on bikes get swooped more often, and that's because of the speed that you're moving through that breeding territory. The magpie doesn't have time to assess what level of threat you are, so it will just be more likely to attack anyway. And you will get magpies, the research shows they can recognise up to at least 30 faces, probably many more. And if you're in their neighbourhood all year and you don't want to be swooped by magpie in springtime, the best thing you can do is make friends with a magpie. And that doesn't have to mean you feed them. It can just be out there, acknowledge them and sort of act in a way that's non-threatening throughout the year. It's a year-long project. The magpies get used to you and they know that you're not a threat. And it's not like they suddenly switch Jekyll and Hyde personality and they hate you all of a sudden. I mean, some people are often confused because they think they have a good relationship with their local magpie and then they get swooped. But what they may have done inadvertently is taken some action, like even just standing near the nesting tree and looking up at it without even realising that it's there. But the magpie doesn't know that and it's actually thinking, you're trying to work out how to get to my chicks. And it can remember that for many years afterwards. So really, magpie swooping happens in spring, but it's a year-round problem we need to address.
Yeah, so I've recently moved into a new area and I've made it my mission to befriend my local magpies. So, because I have a dog, right, and my dog's intuition is to chase them. So I always make sure that when we're on leash near the magpies, he's not allowed to chase them. I always smile and say hi to them. I know I probably look like an insane woman, but I do genuinely want to befriend them so I'm not getting swooped because it's that time of year. Look, let's say being friends with the local magpies is pushing it for somebody. How can we better coexist with magpies then?
The thing, if people know why they're swooping and what the behaviour entails, then we're going to be able to avoid that risk a lot easier. And when you look at the injuries that are suffered by people, the serious injuries, and this is sort of a bit of a rite of passage and a bit of a laugh in some ways, but being swooped by magpies can be terrifying. There's no denying that. And sometimes serious injuries result. But when you go through most of those serious injuries, it's the reaction to the swooping on behalf of the person that is the main driver of serious injury. For instance, people freaking out when they get swooped and crashing their bike, something like that. So if you understand the magpie's behaviour and their motivation, you'll be able to mitigate against the most severe swooping. And the first thing to remember is that they're defending the nest. So the magpie is risking its own health by swooping you. So they really don't want to swoop. So they won't keep pursuing you once you're out of what they perceive as the danger zone around the nest. And the research shows that's probably just about 100 metres around the nest or so, depending on the local conditions. So if you find yourself in an area where you didn't know there was a magpie swooping, you get swooped and you don't know where the nest is, the best thing you can do is to stop, and rather than run around wildly or try and attack the magpie or scream, that's just going to entrench that thought in the magpie that you are a danger, is to stop, assess the situation, work out where the magpie has gone, try and keep an eye on it so you know if it's swooping you again, and they're less likely to swoop if you're looking at them. They do prefer the element of surprise because it's a bit safer for them, but they will swoop again from the front if you don't get out of their territory. And to get out of the territory, if you don't know where the nest is, the best thing is just to backtrack where you've come from. And you'll pretty soon work out where the swooping zone is because they'll fly back to a tree and leave you be. So really, it's counterintuitive and it's in the heat of the battle, it's really hard to do. But just to remain calm and retrace your steps is actually the thing that's going to prevent you from being injured.
Mm-hmm. What about for our cycling listeners of this podcast? Now, we've seen the funny little spikes that people put on their helmets or gluing big googly eyeballs to the back. Do those measures work?
The results are mixed. Anecdotally, people say they work. But if they do work, they only work for certain birds, just like certain magpies will only swoop particular types of people. Those sort of measures may work in individual cases, but overall they're not guaranteed. The eyes possibly can work sometimes, but again, there's also lots of anecdotal evidence that they do nothing. So it depends on the bird. The spikes on the helmet, they don't stop you being swooped, but it means that the apex or the sort of highest point where that they can make contact with you is further away from your vulnerable areas around your eyes. So that's probably worthwhile doing. It won't stop the swooping, but it is certainly going to minimise some of the injuries that you might get. But the best advice for people on bikes, and it's not foolproof, is what we've found in the research is that people who get off their bike, stop and get off and walk their bike, are far less likely to get swooped again. It's as much as anything, it's the speed at which you're going because, as I said, the magpie can't identify who you are. It can't work out if you're a threat. All it knows is that something really fast is going near its nest. So if you actually get off and walk your bike calmly, in many cases that will alleviate the problem.
Sean, what do you wish more of us knew about these birds?
I think if people just appreciated what they are doing, what motivates them, and it's that love of their children, that they're protecting their chicks, then I think we wouldn't feel so antagonistic. But also magpies are incredible birds. We know that many Australians love magpies. Their song is just so evocative of the Australian landscape. And they're really intelligent too. The studies on magpies show they're right up there with cognitive abilities in birds, right up there with the smartest birds we know of, like cockatoos and ravens and crows and those sorts of things. And even though magpies aren't related to ravens or crows, they're in a separate, distinctly Australian family. They are very similar in a lot of ways, including their intelligence. And the research shows their ability to problem solve, their ability to recognise faces. They can basically count, we think. So they're an incredibly smart, adaptive and resilient bird, and they're things we love in our fellow Australians. So we should be championing and celebrating those in our magpies.
Absolutely. Sean, thank you so much for indulging my desire to talk about magpies on this podcast. I very much appreciate it.
My pleasure.
That was Sean Dooley chatting with me there. And that is it for this episode of The Briefing. We would love it if you could share this app with someone you think might enjoy it. And if you want to keep up with our other content, we put up heaps on Instagram, search The Briefing Podcast. We're also on TikTok and YouTube, search Listener Newsroom. We'll be back in your feed with another ep this afternoon from 3. I'm Sacha Barbour Gatt. See you next time.
Listener.